Frank Wellington froze mid-stride on the shelter's cracked linoleum floor, his weathered hand gripping the missing dog flyer as his eyes locked onto the security monitor. The grainy black-and-white footage showed a German shepherd cowering in the corner while a young man's hand struck down hard across the animal's muzzle. It wasn't just any dog getting beaten. It was Thunder. The flyer crumpled in Frank's trembling fingers as Grace Hoffman gasped behind the reception desk, her coffee mug shattering against the floor in a spray of ceramic and liquid. The sound echoed through the cramped office like a gunshot, causing other volunteers to spin around in alarm. Frank's throat constricted as he watched his old partner, the same dog who'd saved 3 children from that warehouse fire, who'd slept beside Margaret's hospital bed during her final days, press himself desperately against the kennel wall. The timestamp read 9:47 a.m., just 20 minutes ago. "Call the police," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. Now. What had they done to Thunder during these 6 missing months? And who was willing to hurt a war hero to keep their secrets buried? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months had passed since Thunder vanished without a trace, and Frank Wellington felt every single day like a knife twisting in his chest. At 68, the retired fire chief had dedicated 40 years of his life to saving others, but he couldn't save the one soul that mattered most to him now. Thunder wasn't just his canine partner from the old days. He was the last living connection to Margaret, Frank's wife of 37 years who'd lost her battle with Alzheimer's 2 years prior. The small town of Riverside County, California, population 15,000, had always been the kind of place where neighbors looked out for each other. Nestled in the high desert where the San Bernardino Mountains met endless stretches of sagebrush and Joshua trees, it was a retirement haven where folks came to live out their golden years in peace. Frank had moved here with Margaret after his retirement, drawn by the promise of quiet mornings and star-filled nights. Instead, he'd found himself trapped in a waking nightmare of loss and searching. Thunder had been Margaret's project during her final lucid months. The 7-year-old German shepherd, a decorated military working dog with 3 purple hearts and a chest full of commendations, had been assigned to their local fire department as a therapy animal for trauma victims. Margaret, with her infinite patience and gentle touch, had trained him to provide comfort to families in crisis. The star-shaped scar on Thunder's forehead, a permanent reminder of an IED blast in Afghanistan, had become a symbol of resilience in their community. When Margaret's mind began to fade, Thunder never left her side. He seemed to understand her confusion, offering his presence without judgment when she forgot Frank's name or called out for her long-dead mother. In her final days, Thunder had lain beside her hospital bed, his brown eyes reflecting a wisdom that spoke of shared suffering and unconditional love. "Promise me you'll take care of him," Margaret had whispered during one of her last coherent moments, her frail hand resting on Thunder's massive head. "He's going to need you as much as you need him." Frank had made that promise with tears streaming down his weathered face, never imagining how prophetic those words would become. Thunder had disappeared during what should have been a routine morning walk around the neighborhood. Frank had stepped inside for barely 5 minutes to answer his daughter Sarah's call from Seattle, a conversation that had turned into another painful argument about his refusal to move into assisted living. When he'd returned to the yard, Thunder was gone. The months that followed had been a blur of sleepless nights and desperate searching. Frank had spent his modest Social Security checks on gas money, driving hundreds of miles following every false lead and hopeful sighting. His health had suffered. Choosing between heart medication and printing more missing dog flyers had become a monthly decision. His estranged daughter's calls had stopped altogether after he'd refused her ultimatum to get over it and move on. Now, staring at that security monitor, Frank's world tilted on its axis. His Thunder, his Margaret's Thunder, had been here all along, suffering in silence just 15 miles from home. Grace Hoffman had arrived at the Riverside County Animal Shelter that Tuesday morning with a heavy heart and lighter wallet. At 32, she juggled 3 part-time jobs to support herself and her 6-year-old daughter Lily, but volunteering at the shelter wasn't about money, it was about hope. Every rescued animal represented the possibility that broken things could heal, that abandoned souls could find love again. It was a lesson she desperately needed to believe for herself. The shelter sat on the outskirts of town like a forgotten afterthought, its beige concrete walls and chain-link runs housing the county's unwanted animals. Budget cuts had reduced the staff to a skeleton crew, leaving volunteers like Grace to fill the gaps between overwhelmed workers and desperate animals. She'd been coming here for 8 months, ever since Lily's father had disappeared with their savings and left them scrambling to survive on Grace's income as a part-time veterinary technician. When Grace discovered Thunder missing from Kennel 12, her first thought was that someone had finally adopted the beautiful German Shepherd who'd been brought in 3 weeks earlier. The intake form listed him as Maverick, a stray found wandering Highway 74 with no collar or identification. But Grace had suspected there was more to his story. The way he carried himself spoke of training and discipline, and his alert brown eyes held an intelligence that suggested a purpose beyond being someone's pet. Her optimism faded when she found the kennel door hanging slightly ajar, the lock mechanism clearly faulty. A cold dread settled in her stomach as she began searching the facility, calling softly for the missing dog. The other animals seemed agitated, their restless pacing and whining creating a symphony of anxiety that matched her growing panic. She found Thunder in the supply closet, pressed against the back wall behind stacks of donated blankets and feeding bowls. His massive frame was curled into the smallest possible space, his body trembling with a fear so profound it made Grace's chest ache. When she called his name, he flinched as if expecting another blow, his eyes darting past her to the doorway as if calculating escape routes. Grace had seen trauma before, in animals and in mirrors. She recognized the posture of someone who'd learned that the world was dangerous, that trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. Moving slowly, she lowered herself to the concrete floor and settled against the opposite wall, giving Thunder space while making herself non-threatening. "Hey there, beautiful boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the shelter's constant din of barking and meowing. "You're safe now. Nobody's gonna hurt you anymore." For the next hour, Grace simply sat and read aloud from a children's book she kept in her volunteer bag, Lily's favorite story about a lost puppy finding his way home. It was a technique she'd learned from her veterinary training, using calm, rhythmic speech to help traumatized animals associate human presence with safety. Thunder remained motionless except for his eyes, which occasionally flicked toward her voice before darting away again. The breakthrough came when shelter manager Tom Brady arrived to investigate Thunder's disappearance. Grace heard his footsteps approaching and saw Thunder's entire body tense, preparing to bolt. Without thinking, she began humming, the same lullaby she sang to Lily during thunderstorms, a melody her own mother had used to chase away childhood fears. Thunder's ears shifted forward, just slightly, and for the first time since she'd found him, his breathing seemed to slow. Tom's discovery of the security footage changed everything. Grace watched in horror as the timestamp showed Danny Morrison, the 22-year-old part-time worker, striking Thunder across the muzzle when the dog had cowered away from him. The video captured Thunder's yelp of pain, the way he'd pressed himself against the kennel wall, the casual indifference with which Danny had continued his work. "This isn't the first time," Tom muttered, fast-forwarding through hours of footage. "Look at this." The recordings revealed a pattern of escalating aggression, Danny shoving dogs roughly into kennels, yanking on leashes, using excessive force to move animals who were simply frightened or confused. Grace felt sick watching Thunder endure weeks of this treatment, his spirit slowly breaking under the weight of casual cruelty. "We have to call the police," Grace said, her voice shaking with anger. "And animal control needs to know about this." Tom hesitated, his face reflecting the complex calculations of a man trying to keep an understaffed, underfunded facility operational. "Grace, if this gets out, if we lose our county funding—" "Then what?" Grace shot back. "We let Danny keep hurting animals because we're afraid of bad publicity?" As they argued, neither noticed the elderly man who'd entered the shelter's front office, clutching a weathered, missing dog flyer with desperate hands. Frank Wellington had spent 6 months searching for Thunder, following every lead, posting flyers on every corner, refusing to accept that his partner might be gone forever. The sound of Grace calling for help would bring him running toward the supply closet, toward a reunion that would change all their lives in ways none of them could imagine. Frank's boots echoed against the shelter's linoleum as he approached the supply closet, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that threatened to trigger another episode. At his age, excitement could be as dangerous as despair, but nothing could have prepared him for the sound that stopped him cold in the doorway. A low, questioning whine that he'd recognize anywhere, even after 6 months of silence. Thunder's massive head lifted from between his paws, ears swiveling forward as his nostrils flared, processing a scent that triggered memories buried beneath layers of trauma and fear. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Thunder's brown eyes widened with recognition so profound it seemed to shatter something inside Frank's chest. "Thunder?" Frank's voice cracked like a teenager's, barely more than a whisper. "Is that really you, boy?" The transformation was instantaneous and miraculous. Thunder's entire body language shifted from cowering victim to joyful recognition, though he moved carefully, as if afraid this reunion might be another cruel trick. He rose on unsteady legs and took tentative steps toward Frank, tail beginning a hesitant wag that gained momentum with each forward movement. When they finally connected, Frank dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around Thunder's neck, burying his face in the familiar warmth of his partner's fur. The German shepherd pressed against him with desperate intensity, whimpering and trembling not from fear now, but from relief so powerful it seemed to emanate from his very soul. "I thought I'd lost you forever," Frank whispered, his voice muffled against Thunder's coat. "I looked everywhere, boy, every road, every shelter, every farm between here and Mexico. Margaret would have had my hide if I'd given up on you." Grace watched from the doorway, tears streaming down her cheeks as she witnessed a reunion that seemed to heal something broken in both man and dog. This wasn't just an owner finding his pet. This was family finding each other again, love proving stronger than whatever hell Thunder had endured. Dr. Sarah Chen, the shelter's part-time veterinarian, arrived within the hour to examine Thunder. Her findings painted a disturbing picture that went far beyond Danny Morrison's documented abuse. Thunder showed signs of prolonged stress that suggested months of mistreatment, not weeks. His microchip, when scanned, revealed data that had been deliberately altered, registration information that led to dead ends and false addresses. "Someone went to considerable trouble to obscure this dog's identity," Dr. Chen explained, her normally cheerful demeanor replaced by professional concern. "These aren't random changes. This is systematic data manipulation." More troubling were the chemical traces found in Thunder's fur and the small puncture wounds on his neck that suggested forced sedation. Frank's law enforcement instincts, dormant since retirement but never truly gone, began cataloging the evidence with growing alarm. "Frank," Grace said quietly, pulling him aside while Dr. Chen continued her examination. "I need to tell you something about how Thunder came to be here." She led him to Tom Brady's office, where the shelter manager reluctantly showed Frank the intake records. According to the paperwork, Thunder, listed as Maverick, had been brought in by an anonymous Good Samaritan who claimed to have found him wandering near Highway 74. The description was vague, the contact information fake, and the signature illegible. But here's the thing, Grace continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. I reviewed our security footage from that day. The person who brought Thunder in, it was Danny Morrison, the same guy who's been abusing him. Frank's weathered hands clenched into fists as the implications crashed over him like a cold wave. You're telling me that son of a bitch brought Thunder here himself? That he's been torturing my dog for sport? It gets worse, Tom admitted reluctantly. Danny claimed he found Thunder as a stray, but the timestamp on our cameras shows he brought him in after hours using his employee key. And Frank, I've been going through our records. We've had an unusual number of German Shepherds brought in over the past year, all by anonymous sources, all ending up, well, most didn't make it out alive. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of barking from the kennels. Frank felt something cold and familiar settle in his gut. The same instinct that had kept him alive during house fires and dangerous rescues, the recognition that what appeared to be an isolated incident was actually part of something much larger and more sinister. There's more, Grace said, her hands shaking as she pulled up something on Tom's computer. I've been researching missing dog reports in the surrounding counties. Frank, there's a pattern. German Shepherds with military or police training, all disappearing under suspicious circumstances, all traced back to shelters in this region. Frank studied the screen, his mind racing through possibilities that grew darker with each connection. Thunder wasn't just any dog. He was a decorated military working dog with specialized training and knowledge that some people might consider dangerous. His disappearance hadn't been random, it had been targeted. What exactly did Thunder do during his service? Grace asked quietly. Frank hesitated, bound by old habits of discretion, but the evidence before him demanded honesty. Thunder wasn't just a therapy dog, Grace. He was trained in explosive detection, drug interdiction, and— He paused, remembering Margaret's gentle influence. Let's just say he has skills that certain people might find inconvenient. As if summoned by their conversation, Thunder appeared in the doorway, moving stiffly but with purpose. His alert posture and focused attention suggested he'd picked up on something, a scent, a sound, some stimulus that triggered his training. He moved to Frank's side and sat at attention, a behavior that spoke of years of conditioning and discipline. "What is it, boy?" Frank asked, his voice automatically dropping to the quiet command tone he'd used during their working days. Thunder's response was immediate and alarming. He moved to the office window and began a low, steady growl, his gaze fixed on something in the parking lot that Frank couldn't yet see, but instinctively knew spelled trouble. Through the office window, Frank spotted a black Ford Explorer with tinted windows idling in the shelter's gravel parking lot. The vehicle hadn't been there when he'd arrived, and something about its positioning, angled for a quick exit while maintaining clear sight lines to the building's entrances, triggered every instinct honed by 40 years of emergency response work. Thunder's growl deepened, his hackles rising as he pressed against Frank's leg. This wasn't the fearful cowering they'd witnessed earlier. This was the alert behavior of a working dog who'd identified a genuine threat. Frank's hand automatically moved to Thunder's head, a gesture that had calmed both of them during countless dangerous situations over the years. "Grace, step away from the window," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life or death decisions. "Tom, is there a back exit to this building?" Before Tom could answer, Grace's phone buzzed with a text message. Her face paled as she read it, her hands beginning to shake. "It's from Danny Morrison. He says he knows I've been asking questions about the dogs and that accidents happen to people who can't mind their own business." Frank felt ice water flow through his veins. In his experience, people who made threats like that weren't bluffing, they were escalating. "Grace, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Call 911 right now and tell them we have a situation at the shelter." Then I want you to take Thunder and go out the back door." "I'm not leaving you here alone," Grace protested. But Frank was already moving toward his truck, his mind shifting into the tactical mode that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous rescues. "This isn't about bravery, it's about protecting what matters," Frank said firmly. "Thunder has been through enough, and you've got a little girl who needs her mother to come home safe." The next few hours unfolded like a carefully orchestrated nightmare. Or Frank's call to his old contacts in law enforcement revealed disturbing information that connected Thunder's disappearance to a much larger criminal enterprise. Detective Jim Martinez, Frank's former colleague who now worked countywide investigations, arrived at the shelter with backup and a grim expression. "Frank, we've been tracking a regional operation for months," Martinez explained as they huddled in the shelter's break room. "Organized theft of working dogs, military, police, search and rescue animals. These aren't random kidnappings. They're targeted acquisitions of animals with specific skills and training." The pattern Martinez described was sophisticated and chilling. Criminal organizations had discovered that retired or active working dogs possessed abilities that made them either valuable assets or dangerous threats. Dogs trained in drug detection could compromise smuggling operations. Animals with explosive detection skills could interfere with illegal weapons trafficking. The solution, from the criminal's perspective, was elegant and brutal. Steal the dogs, erase their identities, and either exploit their skills or eliminate them entirely. Thunder wasn't taken by some random dogfighter, Martinez continued. He was taken because someone knew exactly what he was capable of, and they saw him as a problem that needed to be solved. Grace's research into missing German Shepherds had inadvertently uncovered a network that stretched across 3 states, using rural animal shelters as processing centers for stolen working dogs. The shelters provided perfect cover: legitimate businesses with minimal oversight, high turnover rates, and built-in explanations for why animals might disappear through adoption or euthanasia. "Danny Morrison isn't the mastermind here," Martinez explained. "He's a low-level player, probably recruited because he had access to the shelter and a willingness to herd animals. But someone higher up the chain is calling the shots, someone with connections to law enforcement who knows which dogs to target." The revelation hit Frank like a physical blow. Someone with inside knowledge had identified Thunder as a threat and orchestrated his kidnapping. The implications were staggering: corruption that reached into the very institutions Frank had spent his life trusting and serving. As if summoned by their conversation, Frank's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he recognized but hadn't seen in months. Chief Robert Stone, Frank's former partner and oldest friend on the force. They'd worked together for 15 years before Frank's retirement, sharing the bond that came from facing danger side by side. Stone's promotion to chief had come with Frank's enthusiastic recommendation. "Frankie," Stone's familiar voice carried warmth and concern, "I heard through the grapevine that you found Thunder. Thank God, buddy. I know how much that dog means to you." Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. In his darkest moments over the past 6 months, he'd wondered if he was losing his mind, if his desperate search for Thunder was the obsession of a lonely old man who couldn't accept loss. Having Stone acknowledge the importance of his reunion felt like validation from someone who truly understood. "Bobby, I can't tell you how good it is to hear your voice," Frank said, stepping away from the others for privacy. "It's been hell, not knowing what happened to him. But there's something else going on here, something bigger than just a missing dog." Stone listened intently as Frank described the evidence they'd uncovered. The systematic theft of working dogs, the corruption at the shelter, the network of criminal activity that seemed to stretch far beyond Riverside County. Frank found himself pouring out months of frustration and fear, trusting Stone with details that he'd held back from everyone else. "Frank, this sounds dangerous," Stone said after a long pause. You need to be careful who you trust with this information. If there really is corruption involved, you could be putting yourself and that young lady in serious jeopardy. That's why I'm calling you, Bobby. I need someone I can trust absolutely, someone who can help me navigate this without getting Grace or Thunder hurt." Stone's response was immediate and reassuring. "Of course, Frankie. You know I'd do anything for you. Look, why don't you bring Thunder to the station? We can provide protection while we sort this out, and I can make sure the right people hear about what you've discovered." Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Having Stone's support meant access to resources and protection that could keep everyone safe while justice took its course. They arranged to meet at the police station in 2 hours, giving Frank time to collect Thunder and Grace and ensure they had all the evidence properly documented. As Frank ended the call, he noticed Thunder's behavior had changed again. The German Shepherd was no longer focused on external threats, but was instead watching Frank with an intensity that seemed almost human in its complexity. There was something in those brown eyes, a warning, a question, a recognition of something Frank hadn't yet understood. "What is it, boy?" Frank asked, kneeling beside his partner. "What are you trying to tell me?" Thunder moved to Frank's jacket, the one he'd worn during the phone call, and began the specific alerting behavior Frank remembered from their working days. It was subtle, a focused sniffing, a tense posture, a particular way of holding his head that indicated he'd detected something significant. Grace watched the interaction with growing unease. "Frank, what does that mean? What's he responding to?" Frank's blood ran cold as understanding crashed over him. Thunder was alerting to his phone, to the conversation he'd just finished, to something about the call that had triggered his partner's trained responses. In the old days, Thunder had been trained to detect more than just explosives and drugs. He'd been part of a specialized unit that could identify electronic surveillance equipment, hidden recording devices, and other technological threats. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, staring at his phone with new comprehension. "Thunder, are you telling me this phone is compromised? That someone's been listening to my calls?" Thunder's response was immediate and clear, the same alert signal he'd used hundreds of times during their working days to indicate a positive detection. Frank's phone, his lifeline to the outside world during months of searching for Thunder, had been monitored. Every conversation, every lead he'd followed, every contact with law enforcement had been reported to someone else. The implications were staggering and terrifying. Someone had been tracking Frank's investigation from the beginning, staying one step ahead of his efforts to find Thunder. Worse, his phone call to Stone had just revealed their location, their evidence, and their plan to meet at the police station. "Grace, we need to leave. Right now," Frank said, his voice tight with urgency. "And we can't go to the police station. We can't trust anyone in law enforcement until we figure out how deep this corruption goes." As they gathered their evidence and prepared to flee, Frank's mind raced through the bitter possibilities. If his phone had been monitored for months, then someone with significant resources and insider access had been orchestrating Thunder's disappearance and the subsequent cover-up. The casual way Stone had suggested bringing Thunder to the station suddenly seemed less like protection and more like a trap. Thunder pressed against Frank's leg, offering comfort and solidarity in the face of betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. They were truly on their own now. An old man, a young woman, and a traumatized dog against an enemy they couldn't see, and institutions they could no longer trust. The Black Explorer was still in the parking lot when they left through the back exit, but Frank noticed 2 additional vehicles had joined it, a pattern that suggested coordinated surveillance rather than coincidence. As they drove away in Grace's battered Honda, Frank caught Thunder watching the mirrors with the vigilant attention of a soldier who knew the enemy was closing in. Grace's Honda Civic wheezed up the winding mountain road toward her Aunt Mary's cabin, the engine straining against the steep grade while Frank clutched the door handle and fought to keep his breathing steady. In the rearview mirror, he could see Thunder panting in the back seat, his alert eyes scanning the road behind them for signs of pursuit. The black Explorer had disappeared from view 20 minutes ago, but Frank's law enforcement instincts told him they weren't safe yet. Professional surveillance teams knew how to maintain distance while keeping targets in sight. "How much farther?" Frank asked, his voice tight with the strain of suppressing his growing panic. At 68, with a heart condition exacerbated by months of stress and poor diet, he was operating on borrowed time and pure determination. "Another 10 minutes," Grace replied, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as she navigated the narrow switchbacks. "Aunt Mary's place is completely off-grid. No cell service, no internet, no way for anyone to track us electronically." The irony wasn't lost on Frank that they were fleeing to the kind of isolated location he'd spent his career racing toward during emergency calls. But this time, civilization represented danger, and the wilderness offered sanctuary. As they climbed higher into the San Bernardino Mountains, Frank's phone showed no signal bars, a relief that felt like the first clean breath he'd taken in hours. The cabin materialized through the pine trees like something from a postcard, all weathered wood and stone chimneys, surrounded by towering ponderosa pines and the kind of silence that city dwellers paid thousands to experience for a weekend. Aunt Mary emerged onto the porch before they'd even parked, a 73-year-old woman whose silver hair and gentle smile belied the shotgun she carried with casual familiarity. "Grace, honey, what's wrong?" Mary called out, setting the weapon aside as she recognized the tension in her niece's posture. "And who's this handsome fella you've brought to meet me?" Grace's composure finally cracked as she fell into her aunt's embrace, 6 months of suppressed fear and exhaustion pouring out in racking sobs. Frank watched the reunion while Thunder pressed against his legs, both man and dog understanding that this moment of safety was precious and probably temporary. "Aunt Mary, we're in trouble," Grace managed between tears. "Real trouble, the kind where people might get hurt if we're not careful." Mary's expression shifted from concern to the kind of steel-backed determination that ran in Grace's family. "Well then, let's get you all inside and figure out what needs doing. Thunder, is it? You look like you could use a good meal and a soft place to rest." As they settled around Mary's kitchen table, Frank found himself studying the older woman with professional appreciation. Her movement spoke of someone who'd lived alone in the mountains for decades, self-reliant and unafraid. The cabin itself was a masterpiece of off-grid living, solar panels on the roof, a well-stocked pantry, and enough supplies to weather any storm, natural or man-made. "Now then," Mary said, setting down mugs of coffee strong enough to dissolve spoons, "suppose you tell me why you're running from the police with a dog that looks like he's seen more action than most soldiers." Frank laid out the evidence methodically, his fire chief training helping him present the facts in logical sequence despite the emotional weight of the revelations. Mary listened without interruption, her weathered hands moving absently to scratch Thunder's ears as the German Shepherd positioned himself between her chair and the door, protective instincts intact despite his recent trauma. "So you're telling me," Mary said when Frank finished, "that someone's been stealing working dogs to use in criminal operations, and they've corrupted enough law enforcement to cover their tracks?" "That's the size of it," Frank confirmed. "And my phone call to Chief Stone just told them exactly where to find us." Mary was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that reminded Frank of Margaret's thinking pattern. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. 20 years ago, before I moved up here, I was a federal prosecutor in Los Angeles, specialized in organized crime and public corruption. What you're describing isn't just local criminal activity. It's a sophisticated operation with serious financial backing and insider protection. Grace looked up from where she'd been checking her phone for messages from her babysitter. You think this goes higher than we realized? Honey, operations like this don't survive without protection at multiple levels. Local police, county officials, maybe even state connections. The fact that they were able to monitor Frank's phone for months suggests resources and expertise that go way beyond small-town corruption. Frank felt his chest tighten as the implications sank in. If Mary was right, then their enemy wasn't just Chief Stone or some regional criminal network. It was a conspiracy with tentacles reaching into institutions he'd spent his life respecting and serving. Thunder suddenly raised his head from Mary's lap. Ears pricked forward as he focused on something outside the cabin's walls. His body language shifted to high alert, the same posture Frank remembered from their working days when Thunder had detected an imminent threat. "What is it, boy?" Frank whispered, automatically dropping his voice to avoid carrying sound. Mary moved to the window with the fluid motion of someone accustomed to mountain living, where wildlife encounters were common and caution was a survival skill. What she saw made her face go pale. "We've got company," she said quietly. "3 vehicles coming up the access road. Black SUVs with government plates." Frank's heart hammered against his ribs as he joined Mary at the window. The vehicles were still half a mile away, but their purposeful movement and coordinated formation spoke of professional operation rather than coincidental arrival. Thunder's alert behavior had given them perhaps 5 minutes of warning, enough time to think, not enough to run. "How the hell did they find us so fast?" Grace whispered, her voice shaking with fear and confusion. Mary's expression was grim as she retrieved her shotgun from beside the door. "Frank, that phone of yours, even with no signal, some devices can be tracked through GPS as long as the battery's connected. If they've been monitoring you for months, they probably installed tracking software during one of your service visits." Frank stared at his phone with the dawning horror of someone who'd been carrying his own betrayal in his pocket. Every stop he'd made during his search for Thunder, every shelter he'd visited, every lead he'd followed, all of it had been reported to the people who'd stolen his partner in the first place. "Can we disable it?" Grace asked desperately. "Too late for that," Mary replied, checking the shotgun's load with practiced efficiency. "They're already here." "But there's something else we can try." She moved to an old ham radio setup in the corner of the cabin, its tubes glowing to life as she powered up equipment that looked like it belonged in a World War II movie. "Frank, I need you to think carefully. Do you have any contacts in federal law enforcement who you'd trust with your life? Someone completely outside the local network?" Frank's mind raced through his Rolodex of professional contacts, discarding names as he considered the possibility of corruption at every level. Then he remembered Agent Patricia Williams, a FBI investigator he'd worked with during a terrorism task force 5 years earlier. She'd been methodical, incorruptible, and based out of the Los Angeles field office, far enough removed from local politics to potentially be trustworthy. "Patricia Williams, FBI Los Angeles," Frank said. "If anyone's clean, it's her." Mary's fingers flew over the radio controls with surprising expertise. "Patricia Williams, this is Mary Hoffman, KF66YZ. Emergency traffic for Agent Williams. Repeat, emergency traffic." The static-filled response came back within seconds. "This is Williams. Mary, is that you? It's been years since we worked that judicial corruption case. What's your emergency?" "Patricia, I need you to listen very carefully. I'm with Frank Wellington, retired fire chief from Riverside County. He's uncovered a major criminal conspiracy involving stolen working dogs and public corruption, and there are people with badges trying to kill him right now." The silence on the radio stretched long enough that Frank wondered if they'd lost the connection. When Williams finally responded, Her voice carried the focused intensity of an agent shifting into crisis mode. "Mary, I need you to transmit your exact location and a summary of the evidence. I'm mobilizing a response team now, but you need to stay alive until we can get to you." As Mary began transmitting their coordinates and evidence summary, Frank watched the black SUVs drawing closer. Thunder had positioned himself between the family and the approaching vehicles, his alert posture speaking of a dog prepared to defend his pack, regardless of the odds. Grace moved to Frank's side, her fear obvious but her voice steady. "Whatever happens, we don't let them take Thunder again." Frank nodded, remembering Margaret's final words about taking care of Thunder, about the promises that mattered more than personal safety. Outside, engines could be heard cutting off as the vehicles reached the cabin's clearing. Through the window, Frank could see armed figures moving with tactical precision, surrounding the building with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. "This is Chief Stone," a familiar voice called out through a bullhorn. "Frank, I know you're in there. Come out with the dog and nobody has to get hurt." The betrayal cut deeper than Frank had expected. Bobby Stone, his partner and friend for 15 years, the man who'd stood beside him at Margaret's funeral, was now leading the team that had come to finish what they'd started with Thunder's kidnapping. "Frank," Stone continued, his voice carrying false warmth across the clearing, "you're in over your head here. These people you're with, they're feeding you lies. Come out, and let's talk this through like the old friends we are." Thunder's response was immediate and unmistakable, a low, sustained growl that spoke of recognition and threat assessment. He knew Stone's voice, knew it represented danger despite the friendly words. Mary keyed the radio microphone one more time. "Patricia, they're here. Multiple armed individuals led by someone the target knows personally. We need immediate assistance." William's response crackled through the static. "Hold tight, Mary. Federal units are en route. ETA 12 minutes. Do whatever you have to do to stay alive until then." 12 minutes. Frank looked at Thunder, at Grace's pale but determined face, at Mary's steady hands on her shotgun. 12 minutes to hold off a corruption that reached deep enough to turn lifelong friendships into death sentences. Outside, Bobby Stone's voice took on a harder edge. "Frank, you've got 30 seconds to come out before we come in. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The first shot shattered the cabin's front window, sending glass cascading across Mary's hardwood floor like deadly confetti. Frank instinctively threw himself over Thunder, his body remembering protocols from decades of emergency response training, while Grace scrambled behind the heavy oak kitchen table that Mary had positioned as cover. "So much for talking it through," Mary muttered, chambering around in her shotgun with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years preparing for this exact scenario. Stone's voice carried across the clearing, no longer bothering with false friendship. "Frank, you're only making this harder on yourself. We know about the evidence you collected. Hand over the dog and the files, and we can end this without anyone getting hurt." "Like hell," Frank whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion and exertion. The stress was taking its toll, his chest felt tight, and his left arm had begun to tingle in a way that made him think of Margaret's final days in the hospital. But Thunder pressed against him, solid and warm, and depending on him to keep the promise he'd made to a dying woman. Through the shattered window, Frank could see movement in the tree line. Stone had positioned his team with tactical precision, cutting off potential escape routes while maintaining fields of fire that would make any attempt to flee suicidal. These weren't small-town police officers playing at being tough. They moved with the coordination of people who'd done this kind of work before. Mary keyed the radio microphone again, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Patricia, shots fired at our location. Multiple hostiles with professional equipment. How much longer until your people arrive?" William's response crackled through increasing static. 8 minutes, Mary." "Can you hold that long?" 8 minutes might as well have been 8 hours. Frank could hear Stone organizing his team outside, assigning positions and fields of fire with the casual expertise of someone planning a military operation rather than arresting an old man and his dog. "Grace," Frank called softly, his voice barely audible above Thunder's low growling. "There's something I need you to know, in case we don't make it out of this." Grace looked up from where she'd been checking her phone for any final messages to send to her daughter Lily. Her face was pale but determined, and Frank was struck by how much she reminded him of Margaret in moments of crisis. Frightened, but refusing to be broken. "Thunder isn't just a therapy dog," Frank continued, his words coming fast as he heard Stone's team moving closer to the cabin. "He was part of a specialized federal unit that worked financial crimes. He's trained to detect specific chemical signatures used in counterfeit currency operations." The implications hit Grace immediately. That's why they want him dead, not because he witnessed drug deals, but because he can expose their money laundering operation. Frank nodded, his chest tightening further as the stress compounded his existing heart condition. The stolen dogs, the shelter network, all of it. It's not about fighting rings or illegal breeding. It's about eliminating animals that can detect financial crimes. Outside, Stone's patience finally ran out. "Frank, this is your last warning. Come out now, or we're coming in." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a house fire exploded into flashover. That terrible pause when everyone understands that everything is about to change forever. Then the shooting started in earnest. The first barrage came from 3 directions simultaneously, turning the cabin's windows into showers of glass and splinters. Mary returned fire with her shotgun, the boom echoing through the small space like thunder, while Frank tried to keep Thunder calm as bullets splintered the logs above their heads. "They're trying to drive us toward the back door," Mary shouted over the gunfire. "Classic kill funnel setup." Frank's law enforcement experience kicked in despite his physical distress. Stone was using textbook tactics to herd them into a predetermined killing zone, probably the back bedroom where his team would have clear shots from multiple angles. Thunder's behavior shifted suddenly, his alert posture changing to something Frank recognized from their most dangerous calls together. The German Shepherd was no longer just taking cover, he was calculating, measuring distances and angles with the same precision he'd once used to locate hidden explosives. "What is it, boy?" Frank whispered, following Thunder's intense gaze toward the cabin's stone fireplace. Thunder moved with purpose toward the hearth, his nose working as he investigated something that had captured his attention. When he found what he was looking for, his alert signal was immediate and unmistakable, the same behavior Frank had seen hundreds of times when Thunder detected his target's scent. "Mary," Frank called out urgently. "Thunder's alerting on your fireplace. What's behind that wall?" Mary's face went pale as understanding dawned. "There's a propane line running to the kitchen stove. If they hit that, the cabin would become a death trap, filled with explosive gas and surrounded by armed men." Stone's tactical patience wasn't just about controlling their movements. He was planning to eliminate all the evidence along with the witnesses. Grace looked up from her position behind the table, her eyes wide with recognition. "Frank, if Thunder can smell the gas leak, maybe he can smell other things too. Things that might help us." Frank understood immediately. Thunder's training went beyond detecting explosives and currency. He'd been taught to identify a wide range of chemical signatures, including the specific compounds used in various law enforcement tools. "Thunder, search," Frank commanded quietly, using the same tone that had guided them through countless dangerous operations. Thunder moved through the cabin with systematic precision, his nose working as he cataloged every scent signature in the building. When he reached Mary's gun cabinet, his alert was subtle but unmistakable. Mary followed his indication and opened a locked drawer, revealing items Frank recognized from his years in law enforcement. smoke grenades, flashbang devices, and other tactical equipment that a former federal prosecutor might have retained from her years working dangerous cases. I kept a few souvenirs from my prosecuting days, Mary explained with a grim smile. Figured they might come in handy someday. Outside, Stone's voice carried a new edge of impatience. Frank, I can smell the gas from here. You've got maybe 2 minutes before that whole place goes up. Last chance to come out alive. But Thunder had found something else, his alert behavior drawing Frank's attention to Mary's radio equipment. The German Shepherd's intense focus suggested he'd detected something significant about the electronic setup, something that might give them an advantage Stone couldn't have anticipated. Mary followed Thunder's indication and smiled for the first time since the siege began. Well, I'll be damned. Thunder just found our ace in the hole. She reached behind the radio and pulled out a device Frank didn't recognize, but Mary clearly understood. Emergency beacon, she explained quickly. Sends a direct signal to federal emergency response teams. I activated it the moment I saw those SUVs coming up the road. The revelation changed everything. Stone's careful tactical operation was about to become a federal crime scene, with witnesses and evidence that would be impossible to suppress or eliminate. As if sensing the shift in momentum, Thunder moved to Frank's side and assumed the protective position that had defined their partnership for so many years, alert, focused, and ready to defend his pack against whatever came next. The sound that changed everything wasn't the approach of federal helicopters or the distant wail of sirens. It was Frank's phone ringing with a tone he hadn't heard in over a year. Sarah's ringtone, his estranged daughter calling from Seattle at the worst possible moment in what might be the last hour of his life. Frank stared at the device that had betrayed his location, his finger hovering over the answer button while bullets continued to pepper the cabin walls. Grace looked at him with confusion and growing alarm as he hesitated, torn between the desperate need to hear his daughter's voice one last time and the tactical reality that answering might give Stone's team additional information to use against them. "Frank," Grace whispered urgently, "don't answer that. They could be monitoring her phone too." But Frank's finger was already pressing the green button, his heart making a decision his head couldn't override. "Sarah? Dad, I saw the news." "Channel 7 is running breaking coverage about a standoff at some cabin in the mountains, and they mentioned your name. Please tell me you're not—" Sarah's voice broke, and Frank could hear his 2 grandchildren in the background asking why Mommy was crying. The revelation hit Frank like a physical blow. The media had picked up the story, which meant Stone's careful operation to eliminate witnesses and evidence was already compromised. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would unfold under public scrutiny, making it impossible for the conspiracy to simply disappear their problems. "Sarah, honey, I need you to listen very carefully," Frank said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "I'm in trouble, but I'm not the bad guy here. Whatever you hear on the news, remember that I love you and I'm sorry for all the years we lost." Outside, Stone's tactical patience finally snapped. The news coverage had transformed his clean elimination operation into a public relations nightmare that would require different solutions. Frank could hear him shouting orders to his team, the careful coordination dissolving into desperate improvisation. "All units, we're going in now," Stone's voice carried across the clearing. "Whatever it takes to secure the target and eliminate the witnesses." Mary grabbed her smoke grenades from the gun cabinet, her movements quick and decisive. "Frank, Grace, when I pop these, you take Thunder and head for the root cellar. There's a tunnel that leads to the old mine shaft about 200 yards down the mountain." Grace looked at the older woman with new understanding. "You're not coming with us." "Someone needs to buy you time, and this old prosecutor still has a few tricks left," Mary replied, pulling the pin on the first grenade. "Besides, Patricia Williams is going to need someone alive to testify about what really happened here." The smoke began billowing through the cabin as Mary systematically deployed her tactical supplies, turning the small space into a maze of concealment and confusion. Frank felt his chest tighten further as the smoke aggravated his breathing, but Thunder pressed against him with steady reassurance, guiding him toward the root cellar entrance Mary had indicated. As they prepared to escape, Frank's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Agent Williams, and Frank answered without hesitation, keeping his voice low as Stone's team began their assault on the cabin. "Frank, this is Williams. I need you to know that we've been monitoring Stone's radio communications for the past 20 minutes. Everything he's said and done is being recorded as evidence." The implications were staggering. The federal investigation had been ongoing longer than any of them realized, and Stone's decision to personally lead the assault team had provided exactly the evidence Williams needed to build her case. "Agent Williams, there's something else you need to know," Frank whispered as he followed Grace toward the cellar. "Thunder detected counterfeit currency signatures at the shelter. This whole operation is about protecting a money laundering network." Williams' response was immediate and focused. "Frank, that information is crucial for our investigation. Can you keep Thunder safe until we can get a federal forensics team to examine the evidence he's detected?" As they descended into Mary's root cellar, Frank could hear the gunfight intensifying above them. Mary's tactical experience was evident in how she controlled the engagement, using smoke and concealment to limit Stone's team's advantages while buying precious time for the federal response. The tunnel Mary had mentioned was narrow and roughly hewn, carved decades earlier by miners seeking silver in the mountain's depths. Thunder moved ahead of them with confidence, his training allowing him to navigate the darkness while Frank and Grace struggled with the claustrophobic confines. "How did Mary know about all this?" Grace asked as they crawled through the rocky passage, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Frank's breathing was becoming labored, the combination of stress, smoke inhalation, and physical exertion pushing his damaged heart beyond its limits. 20 years as a federal prosecutor teaches you to prepare for the worst," he managed between gasps. They emerged from the tunnel into the abandoned mine shaft, just as the distant sound of helicopters began echoing off the mountain walls. Frank collapsed against the rocky wall, his chest burning as his heart struggled to maintain rhythm. Thunder immediately moved to his side, pressing against him with the instinctive understanding of a partner who'd seen Frank push through pain before. Grace knelt beside Frank, her veterinary training helping her recognize the signs of cardiac distress. "Frank, you're having another episode. We need to get you medical attention." "Not until this is finished," Frank replied weakly, his voice barely audible over the approaching helicopters. "Not until Thunder is safe." Above them, the sound of gunfire had stopped, replaced by the authoritative voices of federal agents taking control of the scene. Williams' voice carried clearly through the mountain air as she directed her teams with the efficiency of someone who'd planned this operation down to the smallest detail. Thunder's alert behavior suddenly shifted, his attention focused on something in the mine shaft's depths. Frank followed his partner's gaze and saw what had captured Thunder's attention: wooden crates stacked deep in the mine's recesses, their contents hidden, but their purpose becoming clear as Thunder's training kicked in. "Grace," Frank whispered urgently, "Thunder's alerting on something in those crates. This mine shaft isn't abandoned, it's being used as a storage facility." Grace used her phone's flashlight to illuminate the crates, revealing stacks of currency that even in the dim light appeared professionally printed but somehow wrong. Thunder's detection skills had led them to the heart of the counterfeit operation, hidden in a location so remote that discovery should have been impossible. The irony wasn't lost on Frank that Thunder's kidnapping had been designed to protect this very operation, but his escape and survival had led them directly to the evidence that would destroy the conspiracy. The German Shepherd, who'd been marked for death because of his abilities, had used those same abilities to expose the crimes that had cost him 6 months of freedom. Williams' voice echoed down from the mine entrance as her team discovered their location. "Frank, Grace, this is Agent Williams. Medical teams are standing by. Is everyone alive down there?" "We're here," Grace called back, her voice carrying relief and exhaustion in equal measure. "And Agent Williams, you're going to want to see what Thunder found." As federal agents descended into the mine shaft with proper lighting and forensic equipment, Frank watched Thunder assume the alert posture that had defined their partnership for so many years. Even in his weakened state, even after months of trauma and abuse, Thunder remained focused on his mission, detecting threats and protecting his pack. The paramedics who reached Frank first worked with practiced efficiency, stabilizing his heart rhythm while preparing him for transport to the hospital. But Frank's attention remained fixed on Thunder, who was systematically alerting on each crate as federal forensics teams documented the evidence. "He's amazing," Williams said as she knelt beside Frank's stretcher. "In 40 minutes, your dog has provided more evidence than we've gathered in 6 months of investigation." Frank managed a weak smile as they prepared to lift him toward the helicopters waiting above. "Thunder's not just my dog, Agent Williams. He's my partner, and partners never let each other down." As they ascended toward the surface, Frank could see the scope of the federal response. Dozens of agents, forensic teams, and medical personnel transforming Mary's remote mountain cabin into the center of a major criminal investigation. Stone and his team were in custody, their carefully planned operation having collapsed into the kind of evidence-rich disaster that prosecutors dream about. But the sight that mattered most to Frank was Thunder, walking steadily beside his stretcher as they approached the helicopter, ready to continue their partnership wherever it might lead them next. 6 months after the siege at Mary's cabin, Frank Wellington stood on the front porch of his expanded home, watching Thunder demonstrate calming signals to a group of young children from the local elementary school. The German Shepherd's transformation from traumatized victim to confident therapy dog seemed nothing short of miraculous. But Frank knew better than most that healing took time, patience, and the kind of love that refused to give up. The house itself had undergone its own transformation. What had once been a lonely refuge for a grieving widower now bustled with the sounds of family life. Grace and Lily had moved into the converted guest quarters after Grace received a full scholarship to complete her veterinary degree, funded by a community foundation established in Thunder's name. The arrangement had begun as practical necessity, but had evolved into something none of them had expected: a chosen family bound together by shared trauma and mutual care. Sarah had returned from Seattle 3 weeks after the cabin incident, bringing Frank's grandchildren, 10-year-old Michael and 8-year-old Emma, for what was supposed to be a brief visit to check on their grandfather's recovery. The visit had stretched into permanent relocation when Sarah realized how much her father had changed, how the isolation and bitterness that had driven them apart had been replaced by purpose and joy. "Grandpa Frank," Emma called from where she sat cross-legged beside Thunder, "why does Thunder always check the corners of rooms when we go somewhere new?" Frank smiled, remembering his own journey of understanding Thunder's behavioral patterns. "Because Thunder learned that sometimes dangerous things hide in corners, sweetheart. He's just making sure we're all safe." The explanation was simple enough for a child, but carried deeper meaning for Frank, who had spent months in therapy learning to recognize his own trauma responses. Doctor. Rebecca Martinez, the Veterans Affairs counselor who worked with both Thunder and Frank, had helped them both understand that survival behaviors developed during crisis didn't disappear overnight. They had to be gradually replaced with new patterns built on safety and trust. Grace emerged from the house carrying a stack of veterinary textbooks, her face glowing with the satisfaction of someone pursuing a dream deferred but not denied. At 33, she was older than most of her classmates, But her experience with traumatized animals and her role in exposing the counterfeit operation had earned her respect from professors and peers alike. "How did the exam go?" Frank asked, settling into the rocking chair that had become his favorite spot for watching Thunder work with the children. "Passed with honors," Grace replied, her smile bright enough to power the solar panels Sarah had insisted on installing. "Dr. Chen says I have a natural gift for forensic veterinary medicine. Apparently, surviving a federal investigation gives you credibility in certain circles." The investigation itself had become the stuff of legend in Riverside County and beyond. Agent Williams's final report detailed a 12-state counterfeiting operation that had used animal shelters as distribution centers for laundered currency, with stolen working dogs either eliminated as threats or forced to participate in detecting legitimate bills for replacement with fakes. The scheme had generated over $40 million in counterfeit currency over 3 years, protected by a network of corrupted officials that reached from local police departments to state regulatory agencies. Chief Robert Stone's trial had been the most painful part of Frank's recovery. Watching his former partner and oldest friend sentenced to 25 years in federal prison had forced Frank to confront the reality that trust, once broken, left scars that never fully healed. Stone's testimony had revealed the depth of his financial desperation, gambling debts, a son's medical bills, and the slow erosion of integrity that had made corruption seem like survival. He wasn't always a bad man, Frank had told Dr. Martinez during one of their sessions. But somewhere along the way, he forgot that being a good man is a choice you make every day, not a status you achieve once and keep forever. Thunder's own testimony, delivered through his detection abilities rather than words, had been crucial in securing convictions against 14 defendants. Federal forensics teams had marveled at his precision in identifying specific chemical signatures associated with counterfeit currency, leading to the discovery of printing facilities in 3 states and the recovery of equipment worth millions of dollars. The German Shepherd had become something of a celebrity, featured in documentaries about animal intelligence and law enforcement partnerships. But Frank was prouder of Thunder's work with traumatized children and veterans, using his own experience of recovery to help others navigate their healing journeys. Lily bounded onto the porch, her backpack bouncing as she raced home from school with the boundless energy of a 7-year-old who felt completely secure in her world. "Mom, guess what? Mrs. Peterson wants Thunder to come to our career day next week. She says he's the only dog she knows with an actual job." Grace laughed, ruffling her daughter's hair as Thunder approached for his customary welcome-home greeting. "Thunder does have a very important job, baby girl. He helps people learn to trust again." The truth of that statement was evident in Lily's own transformation. The anxious, withdrawn child who had clung to her mother's side during their early days at the shelter had blossomed into a confident little girl who treated Thunder as both protector and playmate. Dr. Martinez had explained that children often recovered from trauma more quickly than adults, especially when they felt genuinely safe, but Lily's progress still amazed Frank with its completeness. Mary Hoffman had made a full recovery from her gunshot wound and had become a fixture at family dinners, regaling the children with stories of her prosecutorial career that made the law sound like the greatest adventure possible. Her cabin had been rebuilt with federal assistance, transformed into a training facility for handlers working with traumatized service animals. The program, officially named the Thunder Recovery Initiative, had already helped 23 animals return to active duty or transition to therapy work. As evening approached, Frank found himself thinking about Margaret and the promise he'd made to care for Thunder. His wife's gentle wisdom seemed to echo in the sounds of family life surrounding him, children's laughter, Grace's patient explanations of veterinary concepts, Sarah's phone calls with clients from her new consulting business. Thunder's contented sighs as he settled into his favorite spot by the fireplace. "You know," Frank said to Grace as they watched the children help Thunder demonstrate his detection abilities for an impromptu audience of neighborhood kids, "Margaret always said that families aren't just the people you're born to. They're the people who choose to stay when staying gets hard." Grace nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. "Thunder taught me that," she replied. "When I found him in that supply closet, broken and afraid, I could have walked away. It would have been easier, safer, but something about his courage made me want to be braver too." The ripple effects of their shared experience continued to spread through the community. The Riverside County Animal Shelter had been completely reorganized under federal oversight, with new protocols for staff training and animal welfare that had become a model for facilities across the country. Danny Morrison had served 6 months in county jail and was now working at a hardware store, apparently grateful for steady employment that didn't involve caring for vulnerable animals. Dr. Marcus Blackwood's conviction on 23 counts of animal cruelty had sent shockwaves through the veterinary community, leading to enhanced oversight and mandatory reporting requirements for suspicious animal deaths. His confession had revealed the systematic murder of working dogs whose detection abilities threatened various criminal enterprises, a revelation that had prompted federal legislation protecting service animals and their handlers. Thunder's Law, as it came to be known, established severe federal penalties for crimes against working animals and created a national database for tracking missing service dogs. Frank had been invited to testify at the congressional hearings, an experience that had filled him with pride for his partner's contribution to protecting other animals from similar fates. As the last of the visiting children headed home for dinner, Thunder settled beside Frank's rocking chair with a satisfied grunt. The German shepherd's graying muzzle and the white patches around his eyes spoke of a life well lived and hard-earned wisdom, but his alert posture showed that retirement hadn't diminished his sense of purpose. "You did good today, partner," Frank said quietly, his weathered hand moving automatically to scratch Thunder's ears. "Margaret would be proud of both of us." Sarah emerged from the house carrying a pot of coffee and wearing the kind of peaceful expression that had replaced the tension and anger that had defined their relationship for so many years. "Dad, Grace has an announcement to make at dinner. Something about her thesis project." Frank smiled, suspecting he knew what Grace's news might be. She'd been working on a research proposal that would establish the first veterinary forensics program in California, with Thunder serving as both case study and training partner for future detection dogs. As the family gathered around the dinner table, Frank at the head, Sarah and her children on one side, Grace and Lily on the other, with Thunder lying beside Frank's chair where he could keep watch over his expanded pack, Frank felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had kept his promises. Thunder's journey from victim to healer had paralleled Frank's own transformation from isolated widower to patriarch of a chosen family. Both had learned that survival wasn't enough. True healing came from finding purpose in helping others, from building connections strong enough to withstand whatever storms might come. Outside, the California sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and American flags along the street stirred gently in the evening breeze. It was the kind of scene that belonged on postcards celebrating small-town values and the enduring strength of the human spirit. But Frank knew it was real because he had helped build it, one day at a time, with the loyalty of a good dog and the love of people who had chosen to become family. Thunder's tail thumped once against the floor as Grace began explaining her research proposal, and Frank understood that their greatest adventures were still ahead of them. This story reminds us that it's never too late to find family, purpose, and hope. Frank Wellington thought his best days were behind him, a widower living on Social Security, estranged from his daughter, searching desperately for his missing partner, Thunder. At 68, he felt forgotten by a world that seemed to value youth over wisdom, efficiency over loyalty. But sometimes life's greatest chapters begin when we think the book is ending. Through Thunder's rescue, Frank discovered that his decades of service, his hard-earned wisdom, and his capacity for love weren't relics of the past. They were exactly what Grace and Lily needed to heal their own wounds. The chosen family they built together proves that loneliness doesn't have to be the price of aging. That experience is a gift worth sharing, and that the bonds we forge through adversity often run deeper than blood. Frank didn't just save Thunder. Thunder saved him right back, leading him to a life richer and more meaningful than anything he'd imagined possible. Your story isn't over. It might just be getting to the best part. Have you ever found unexpected family in the most unlikely places? What moment in your life proved that it's never too late for a fresh start? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story.